We welcome you to our study of the book of Job. Job chapter 10, we'll begin with verse 1. Job chapter 10, verses 1 through 7, Job's complaint. Verse 1, my soul loathes my life. I will give free course to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. Job loathes his life. He's utterly disgusted with living. He will now give free course to his complaint. That is, he will speak freely, openly. He will freely complain in his bitterness, or out of his bitterness, in misery and anguish. In Job 3:20, why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter of soul? Job said. And in Job 7:11, therefore I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. The term loathes is also rendered as grieved in Psalm 95:10 and disgusted in Psalm 119, 158. And so here he describes how that he loathes living in this grief and anguish, that he will give free course, or that he will fully express himself in his complaint before God. Verse 2, I will say to God, do not condemn me. Show me why you contend with me. Job will offer his complaint directly to God. First, he will tell God not to condemn him or to declare him guilty. Job believes that he is innocent. Second, Job will request that God show him why he contends with him, why he argues with him, as with a man in a court. Job 9:3. Verse 3, he continues, does it seem good to you that you should oppress, that you should despise the work of your hands, and smile on the counsel of the wicked? Job offers three questions. First, does it seem good to you to oppress me? Job says that God is mistreating him, he who is innocent. Second, does it seem good to you to despise me? He says that God despises him, the work of God's hands. God created man in his image in Genesis 1:26 and 31. Third, does it seem good to you to smile on the counsel of the wicked? And so he says that God smiles or looks with favor upon the wicked. Job said these things. These were things that Job was feeling. However, these things were not true of God. Again, Job is speaking in the bitterness of his soul. Job 10:1. It is common for man to speak rashly when suffering. Verse 4. Do you have eyes of flesh, or do you see as man sees? Job accuses God of giving a series of rhetorical questions. Job says that God does not have eyes of flesh and does not see as man sees. The point is that God is not limited in his sight, as a man is limited. In verse 5, are your days like the days of a mortal man? Are your years like the days of a mighty man? Job says that the days of God are not like the days of a mortal man. Man dies. And his years are not like the days of a mighty man. God is not limited in length of days or number of days as is a man. Eliphaz, at the beginning of the first round of these speeches, uses the terms for mortal and man back in Job 4 and 17. There we see the point made that a mortal cannot be more righteous than God, nor a man more pure than his maker. Of course, Job never claimed to be purer than God or more righteous than God. Verse 6. That you should seek for my iniquity and search out my sin. God's years are not limited like the days of a mighty man or the years of the mighty man. God is not flesh and mortal, so that he should seek for Job's iniquities and search out his sins. Job makes the point that God should already know, without seeking or without searching, that he is innocent. He accuses God of acting as a mortal man, seeking and searching. Verse 7. Although you know that I am not wicked, and there is no one who can deliver from your hand. Job says that God knows that he is not wicked. He also says that there's no one who can deliver him from God's hand. In a previous lesson, we note how that Job wished for a mediator between God and himself. However, there was no mediator available. Here in verse 7, Job says that God knows that he is not wicked. And he also says that there's no one who can deliver Job from God's hand. Job then says that God knows that he is innocent, and yet he continues to punish him. Verses 1 to 7. Now, verses 8 to 12, Job asks for compassion. Your hands have made me and fashioned me, an intricate unity, yet you would destroy me. Even as Job is suffering and saying things that are rash and sometimes incorrect, sometimes speaking out of desperation, he continues to believe, even though he thinks that God has done this to him. He speaks out of ignorance, and yet he continues to believe. Ignorance of why he suffered. He continues to believe in God. And at times we see praise of God throughout his speeches. Here we see his praise of God for creation of man. Job praises God who made him and fashioned him as a man. He describes the work of God's hands as an intricate unity. It may literally be translated that God fashioned him roundabout or altogether roundabout. This may describe the complexity and the unity of God's handiwork, his design, who made man of skin and bones, skin and flesh with bones and sinews, Job 10 and verse 11. And so all the various parts, and yet there is unity, oneness. This intricate, this complexity of unity, of oneness. Again, commending God and his creation. The psalmist used similar language later in Psalm 119 and 73. Your hands have made me and fashioned me. In the New Testament, in Ephesians 4 and 16, the Apostle Paul wrote, the whole body joined and knit together. However, Job thinks that God will now destroy him. All these things have happened to him. He thinks God has done these things to him. He doesn't know why. He believes himself innocent. His friends think he has done some wickedness. There's ignorance on both sides, friends and himself alike. But he thinks God will now destroy him. That God would carefully fashion him, yet only destroy him, is a mystery to Job. He is perplexed, confused. Verse 9. Remember, I pray, that you have made me like clay, and will you turn me into dust again? Job asks for God's compassion. He prays that God remember the work of his hand, work of God's hand. He asks that God remember how God made him. Like the potter molds or forms the clay, Job then asked if God will now turn him back into dust. We see here the creation of man. We know from Genesis that God formed man of the dust of the ground. Genesis 2:7, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Man was taken from the ground, according to the Genesis account. Moses wrote in Genesis 3:19, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Speaking of man being taken from the ground, from the earth, materials, and ultimately to die, to return to the dust of the ground. Genesis 3:19. David in his psalm also writes that man is dust. Psalm 103:13-14, as a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. For he knows our frame, he remembers that we are dust. So perhaps the psalmist considered what was said here in this passage. Verse 10. Do you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? Job gives another illustration of the work of God's hand. There is the picture of God pouring Job out like milk and the curdling of him like cheese. In making cheese, milk came from goats, sheep, and cows. We see in passages like Judges 4:19 that milk was stored in skin containers. These containers of skin, such as a jug or a skin of milk, Judges 4:19. In making cheese, milk is poured out. It is heated. And along with bacteria, we see the milk congeals into solid curds and is separated from liquid wet. The curds are cut into loaves, left to age, and harden as cheese. Of course, there's different degrees of curdling, but the point here is one of creation, of God making man. Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? Here you have a picture of a man making cheese. And so as a man makes cheese, he pours milk and then he makes the cheese from the milk. We see God made man of the dust of the ground. Like a potter, the clay. He formed a man. Verse 11. Clothe me with skin and flesh, and knit me together with bones and sinews. Job continues to speak of God's creation of man. Did God not clothe him with skin and flesh? and knit him together with bones and sinews. It is sinews and muscle, along with the bones that provide structure, which gives strength to the body. So he has a picture of God clothing him with skin and giving him strength with bones and sinews, muscles. Verse 12, again, that intricate unity that we see here in verse 8. Verse 12, you have granted me life and favor, and your care has preserved my spirit. Again, in this section, we have Job speaking highly of God and his creation, his design of man. Verse 12, Job said back in verse 1, my soul loathes my life. He's suffering, he's enduring these things in life, and so he loathes his life. He's presently suffering and complaining to God in his suffering. However, Job remembers how God had treated him before his grief and calamity. And first, he praises God who granted him life. Second, he also praises God who had shown him favor. The term is also translated as kindness in Job 6:14 and mercy in Job 37:13. And so Job had shown him favor, kindness, and mercy prior to his affliction. Third, Job says that God's care had preserved his spirit. This may refer to the providence of God, God's foresight and care in the life of Job prior to his calamity. Now, in verses 13 to 17, Job points out how he can see no advantage. In verse 13, he says, and these things you have hidden in your heart. I know that this was with you. Note the colon at the end of the passage, indicating what follows, verses 14 and 15. And so these things, as is indicated by the if statements, verses 14 and 15 and following, appear to be what is listed in these verses. Job 10:14 to 16. Yes, God made and fashioned him, verse 8. Yes, God granted him life and favor, verse 12. Yet Job thought that God would destroy him, verse 8, and that God would turn him again into dust. Verse 14. I know that this was with you. If I sin, then you mark me and will not acquit me of my iniquity. Job says that if he would sin, then God would mark him, that God would take note concerning his sin. God carefully watches and knows, he takes note. And God will not acquit him or let his iniquity go unpunished. The passage says how God will mark Job. The same term could be translated as preserved, like in verse 12, such as God will preserve Job for judgment. But as mentioned, the idea of marking or him taking note of Job and his sin, that he watches, that God sees. Job 14:16, for now you number my steps, but do not watch over my sin, and so do not keep track of my sin. Job 14:16. So here in verse 14, Job points out that if he does sin, that God will mark it, he will take note of it, that he will not acquit him of his sin, his iniquity. Verse 15, If I am wicked, woe to me. Even if I am righteous, I cannot lift up my head. I am full of disgrace. See my misery. Job says that if he is wicked, which he does not believe, then woe to him. He describes what would be his miserable condition in judgment. However, if he is righteous, then he will not lift up his head, as he is so full of disgrace, given his present misery, that he will not lift his head up. People will see his misery and conclude that he has sinned. That's what has happened with the friends of Job. They've seen his misery and they conclude that he must be wicked. So Job points out in verse 14 that if I sin, then you mark me, you will not acquit me. If I am wicked, then woe to me. But then again, even if I am righteous, which I believe I am, Job thought, I can't lift up my head. My head's down in disgrace over my affliction. At the beginning of the chapter, he pointed out how he loathed his life. See my misery. And so he points as an illustration to himself, his suffering. Verse 16, he continues, if my head is exalted, you hunt me like a fierce lion. And again, you show yourself awesome against me. Verse 16, even in Job's complaint, he actually praises the awesomeness of God. Job says that if he would lift up his head, that if my head were exalted, God would hunt him like a fierce lion. And so Job, in compliment, says that this is a demonstration of the awesome power of God. And this simile, God is like a fierce lion who would hunt Job or would stalk him. Verse 17, you renew your witnesses against me and increase your indignation towards me. His anger, changes in war are ever with me. And so Job says that God brings witness after witness against him. We have the figure of a court. It's like a long line of hostile witnesses being brought against Job in a court. God increases his indignation towards Job, according to the thoughts of Job. The text reads, changes in war are ever with me. It is as though Job is always in war. When one army is exhausted or depleted in the war, another army comes up against him. And so there is this continual warfare against Job. So he thinks of his situation in this fashion. Verses 18 to 22, Job is complexed. He is perplexed. He is confounded, confused. Verse 18, why then have you brought me out of the womb? Oh, that I had perished and no eye had seen me. Job says that God brings all these things against him, like witnesses in a court, like soldiers, like armies in a war. Job again revisits his wish that he had never been born when he cursed the day of his birth back in Job 3, 1 to 10. Perhaps when someone is suffering greatly, they might have these kinds of thoughts that, oh, I wish I was never born. Anything to avoid the suffering that I am experiencing. And Job felt this way. He questions why God brought him out of the womb of his mother. If it was his lot to suffer? Why did you bring me out of the womb? Why did you deliver me from my mother? If this is my lot to suffer. He wishes that he had perished while still in the womb, and that no one had seen him alive. Back in Job 3:16, he said, "Or why was I not hidden like a stillborn child, like infants who never saw light?" Verse 19. I would have been as though I had not been. I would have been carried from the womb to the grave. And so Job says that it would have been as though he had never existed. It would have been as though he had never been. He would have been carried straight from the womb to the tomb, with no suffering in between. He would not have experienced his present misery. I would like to add to these words of Job that even though he would not have experienced his present misery, he would never have experienced the joys or any joys of life, such as the joys, lives of his children, sons and daughters, his marriage with his wife, or his friendship with his friends, of the people that he would have helped, that he would have taught and instructed. None of that would have been if Job had never been. Sometimes we say some things when we are hurting that we would never otherwise say with given thought. Verse 10 or verse 20, he says, "Are not my days few? Cease, leave me alone, that I may take a little comfort." Job appraises the remainder of his life as being a few days in number. He tells God to cease or to stop his attack. Cease these arguments against him. Cease bringing this war against him. He asks that God leave him alone so that he may have a little comfort in the few days that he had left. We should add that it's a good thing that God did not grant his request. Here we see that he mentions so that he might have a little comfort, little moments of joy, a little cheer in the rest of his life, however long that may have been, however short a time he had left. Verse 21. "Before I go to the place from which I shall not return, to the land of darkness and the shadow of death." Earlier, Job said in Job 7:9, "He who goes down to the grave does not come up." Zophar, later in Job 11:8, will say that the things of God are higher than the heavens and deeper than Sheol. Job 11 and verse 8. Sometimes that Hebrew term, Sheol, is rendered as grave, as we see in Job 7 and 9. And we'll see additional references through our study of the book of Job, such as in Job 11 and 8. The place of Sheol is the abode of the dead. Job describes what he thinks waits him after death. He describes the abode of the dead as a place of no return. Job 7:9, Job 11:8. He adds to his description, first, the place is the land of darkness. Second, the place is the shadow of death. I see those words and I think of the Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd. Here in this passage, and we'll see this expression additional times in the book of Job. The shadow of death. Earlier, Job wished that darkness and the shadow of death would claim the day of his birth, back in Job 3 and 5. Verse 22, the last verse of the chapter. He says, a land as dark as darkness itself, as the shadow of death, without any order, where even the light is like darkness. Job thought that Sheol would be as dark as darkness itself. These may have been thoughts shared by other people of this ancient time. Job didn't have all the information that we have through the benefit of the scriptures. Job, the book of Job may be the oldest book, or at least one of the oldest books of the Bible. Verse 22, Job thought that this place, Sheol, this abode of the dead, to be as darkness itself. Can't be much darker than that. He describes the land as dark as the shadow of death, place without light, and as a place without any order, and so a place of chaos, disorder. I'd like to say a few closing words before we end today. We point out that Job has not turned away from God. He has not turned away from his faith in him. He still believed. He continues to seek God for answers. Why he's suffering, even though he thinks God has brought suffering upon him. Job says some things that are wrong, and yes, at times Job speaks rashly, ignorantly, and out of desperation. And yet Job continues to believe and to seek God. We see at times that he praises him, such as his awesome power, as we saw in this chapter. Well, I hope that this has been helpful. Again, there's always more to learn, and we hope that you do continue to study. We hope that this has been helpful, and Lord willing, we'll continue with next time with Job chapter 11. We thank you for being here today.